Production of Real Ag is made possible in part by an underwriting grant from the Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.
I keep reading about engineered corn, but I don't know what that means.
Spring water, purified water, what's the difference?
Is imported beef safe for my family?
Consumers want to know the facts about the products they buy. That's where Real Ag comes in. From plant to plant and from pasture to plate, Kyle Bauer and the Real Ag crew find the facts to help you sort the truth and help you understand Real Ag. Now here's your host, Kyle Bauer.
Flour milling isn't a glamorous profession, but it's a very important part of a very important process. Flour milling is our topic tonight on Real Ag. Milling involves crushing grain to separate the parts we want from the parts we don't. Seems simple, but it's actually fairly complex.
The very basic definition of milling would be simply the cracking of grain and the separation of the endosperm or the starch inside the kernel with the bran or the seed coat on the outer side of the kernel. We generally talk about wheat milling because flour from wheat is the most common worldwide or globally for consumption, but you can mill any type of grain.
In the milling process, when we bring the grain into the flour mill, we start by cleaning the grain and removing any non-wheat material and also any wheat that may not be ripe for the milling process. So a wheat kernel, we would like a wheat kernel to be nice and full so that when it goes through the milling process and the wheat kernel breaks apart, we'll be able to extract the inner parts of the kernel as flour. And so it's not all wheat kernels as they develop in the field. Not every single wheat kernel has a fully developed inside. And so if the wheat kernel is poorly developed, then we would remove that and it wouldn't actually enter the milling process. So then once the wheat is cleaned, we go through a stage that we call conditioning, which is really just getting the wheat kernel ready for the milling process. So we dampen or we add a little bit of water to the outside of the wheat kernel. We call this conditioning or tempering the wheat kernel. And what happens, that tempering allows the inside that we want to extract as flour. When we open the wheat kernel, that tempering process lets the insides fall apart or break away very easily.
Once the wheat's conditioned, it goes through the milling process. Now the milling process, again in very basic terms, the milling process is basically 3 steps. We have the grinding, the sifting, and the purification. Grinding is simply, the grain passes through large steel rolls, most common, and is ground into a particle size. And then this is a continuous process of grinding and sifting and purification. So after we have the ground product, we send that to a sifter. Well, the sifter is simply a rotating box of multiple sieves that separate the material based on size. From that point, after the sifter, part of that process will go back to a roller mill to be reground. Part of that will go to a purifier, and the purification step is the purification process is really in simple terms an air classifier, where once the particles are separated by size, we can use a purifier to separate based on specific weight or terminal velocity in air, to where when we have pure endosperm particles will fall through an airstream, whereas bran has a lighter density and will float over the top of screens with a little bit of air underneath them. So a purifier separates pure endosperm particles from compound particles that have bran and endosperm connected. So it helps us to produce a whiter, brighter, better quality product.
It's not just wheat that gets milled. Certainly a lot of wheat in this country is what goes through the mills, but almost any other cereal grain is milled as well to one extent or another, and that would include things like oats, like rice, corn, sorghum, soybeans, to produce specialty flours. And in some cases, there's a lot of soy that gets ground or milled, and that's used as an additive to raise the protein levels, to give certain quality characteristics, browning, flavor. It does have some influence on how the proteins in wheat flour acts. There's an ever-increasing use of things like rice flour, corn flour, sorghum flour, because they're gluten-free. Big market right now that's expanding more and more every day, and those are good alternatives for people that are sensitive to gluten. So we see much more of that, that they're using those type of flours to go in every application: bread, cakes, cookies.
When we talk about consistency of the flour that we produce, today's bakery, or the commercial baker today, really needs that flour to be very consistent. And by consistent, I mean the moisture content of that flour is the same day in and day out. The protein content of that flour and the characteristics of that protein in the flour are the same day in and day out.
Every flour mill is different. We can have even in a conventional flour flow diagram, we could have the same basic equipment incorporated into a flour mill flow. We could have two flows that are identical, but the flour produced from each mill is slightly different. So when it comes down to a flour mill, every flour mill is different. Every flour mill has its own unique characteristics, and although from an engineering perspective, two mills could be identical, the flour they produce will have slightly different properties. So, flour mills are almost like fingerprints. No two are exactly alike.
The miller needs to be a scientist, and the miller also needs to be an accountant, and the miller needs to be an engineer in some ways. And so it's not the basic principles of a career in milling or an understanding of milling are based in science. And so we need to understand the chemistry of the grains. We need to understand the chemistry of the flour that we produce. But we also need to understand the accounting and the profit loss kinds of aspects of the milling business. And the milling process itself is very mechanical in nature, and so we're dealing with large equipment that runs on a continuous basis, in some cases 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for several weeks in between stopping. And so you need to understand the engineering principles behind all of the equipment in your milling facility so that the operation goes smoothly every day. The overall milling of grains including wheat, but also corn and barley, oat milling, rice milling, many of the grains that we consume as in our diet are milled grains, and that would include grains used in brewing, but also grains that find their way into uses other than human consumption. So grains that happen to be used for fuel, ethanol, or even cattle feed or animal feed will also be milled. And so the milling process for the different products could be quite different from the milling process for flour, for instance, bread baking. But in general, the equipment that they use and the principles behind that are very similar.
Wheat flour goes into a lot of different products. It's not just bread and hamburger buns. It's the primary ingredient in cookies, crackers, donuts, any kind of pastry that you're looking at for out there. I mean, even something like pet treats. Dog bones are about 85 to 90% wheat flour. So there's a tremendous amount of wheat flour that goes into products that are probably all around people that they may not even realize.
It would be very difficult for anybody in the United States to to eat on a daily basis and not consume a milled product.
Millers have been around for a long time, but the way they do business has changed over the centuries.
People have been breaking grains and milling flour since, the time of the caveman.
In the early days of milling, it would have dated back maybe 10,000 years ago, when people were mostly hunter-gatherer type foraging for their food, and realized that eating grains, raw grains, would wear their teeth down. I mean, is basically how the emergence of grinding or breaking grain happened. And so they found that by using a stone or a couple of stones, they could break the grains apart into smaller pieces, and it made them easier to eat, easier to digest, and easier on their teeth. Over the years, as that process of breaking grain was refined over the last 10,000 years, we started to gather grains as a community and grind them as a community, so that one person or one family of people would produce the ground grains, and then other families would collect the grains or grow the grains as farmers. So it started that early relationship between the farmer and the miller, and at some point they became big enough that the grinder or the miller didn't have time to go do farming. He could only be a miller, and the farmer was growing enough and gathering enough grains that he didn't have time to do the milling. He could only be a farmer, and so the two of them were inseparable. The farmer relied on the miller, and the miller relied on the farmer. We start to see the kind of industrialization of flour milling. So if you look back at the Census of Manufacturing 1910, there's about 21,000 mills on record. Today, there are 168 mills on record. So you can see the change or the evolution of the milling industry from small regional milling, or maybe even not even region, but local milling, to large kind of regional milling industries.
Millers rely on farmers to provide grain with specific properties.
So the farmer is, growing whatever wheat variety grows best in his location, on his fields, in his environment. And most of the time, the farmers are most interested in yield. How many bushels can I get off my acre? And so decisions are made on that kind of quality characteristic of those wheat varieties. And that's not a bad thing, but it makes the different quality characteristics of that wheat vary from one field to the next, one farmer to the next, one county, east of the state, west of the state. And so what that ultimately gives the miller is a very wide range of characteristics in those different wheats that he has to try to balance out to deliver that constant flour quality to the baker. It's really a tricky technical thing for the millers to evaluate all those different wheats and then decide how do they blend them together through their process to give the baker the consistent product that he's looking for.
Consumers demand consistency, so the baker and the miller must work together to achieve a reliable product.
The most important thing about the relationship between the baker and the miller is that what the baker wants is a consistent product every time. The same quality characteristics, so that when he adds a flour to his bread dough or to his cake batter, that flour always absorbs the same amount of water, so that it always mixes to the same degree of development, so that that loaf of bread always expands to the right size, because those are the key quality characteristics that the baker wants to provide to their customer on a continuous and ongoing basis.
When we talk about flour quality, there is no such thing as a bad quality or a low quality flour. The quality of the flour, is really defined by the qualities or the characteristics required to make certain products. A low protein product, a low protein flour may not be the right flour to make a bagel, but it would be the ideal flour to make a donut. So, you know, flour quality is defined, or the qualities for a quality flour are defined by the products that they're making. And, you know, there is no such thing as a poor quality flour. It may just be a good quality flour used for the wrong product. You know, when we talk about the relationship between the miller and the baker, that is a very close relationship. You know, we talk about flour. Well, even wheat flour, you know, there are 6 very different classifications for wheat, from soft wheat to hard wheat to winter wheat to spring wheat, and of course we have durum wheat that is specifically produced for pasta. So, you know, a baker these days, when we talk about the large commercial bakers that are producing the hamburger buns and the sliced bread and the, you know, pizza dough that's in the grocery stores and in the restaurants that we use, every product that uses flour requires a slightly different quality of flour to meet the requirements of the baker. If they're making hot dog buns, they want a separate quality of flour than if they're making white pan bread. And if they're making tortillas, they want different flour qualities than if they're making bread. So that relationship is to where the baker can define the quality of the flour and the characteristics of the flour that they want, and the miller originates the types of wheat and the qualities of wheat that are necessary to meet the baker's requirements.
One role of the miller or the flour mill is to produce a consistent product, and in order to do that, we have to have a consistent raw material. And because not all wheat is grown in the same location, we have wheat that is grown all over the United States that we use in our flour mills. And even, for instance, here in the state of Kansas, we predominantly grow hard red winter wheat. And even within this state, that hard red winter wheat is not the same in its characteristics. So depending on regions of the state, certain wheat sourced from those regions may have a higher or lower protein content, and that wheat with high or low protein content may be used in different products, and it's all still used, but for a certain purpose, for our flour mill's purpose, in order to produce a consistent product, we may have to blend wheat from 2 regions to produce a uniform product with a uniform protein content, so that, again, our flour that we produce from that wheat is consistent and uniform as well. So when you're baking 30,000 loaves of bread per day, every loaf of bread needs to have the same weight. When you look at the label, the bakery, they have the packaging material for their bread printed in mass long before that loaf of bread will ever be baked. And on that packaging, there's a weight, stated weight for the loaf of bread. Also, the nutrient facts on the back will be based off of a bread of a known mass with a certain amount of flour in that formula for the bread. And so for a baker that's producing 30,000 loaves of bread per day, each loaf needs to have the same mass or the same weight. It should fit in that same bag that they've already purchased, and it should be able to be sliced into the same number of slices.
When we think of mills, we think of flour, but not all flour is the same.
Most of the flour that's milled around the U.S. actually goes into commercial application. It goes into bakeries that are making hamburger buns for fast food chains. It goes into bakeries that are making loaves of bread that go into the grocery store. Something less than 5% is probably all that goes into the supermarket. By far, the vast majority goes into commercial operations. The type of flour that gets used depends upon the product that you're trying to make. And if you're trying to make a bagel, you use a much different flour than if you're trying to make a donut. Even though you're trying to end up with something round with a hole in the middle, So they look very much the same, very different characteristics. So with something like a bagel, you're going to use a flour that has typically a higher protein content and a higher protein quality, and protein quality meaning that it forms a dough that has very good quality characteristics of extensibility and elasticity. And that's how you get a bagel that has that nice, hard, shiny surface. It's very chewy when you eat into it, and it's the characteristics that you look for. If you tried to have those same characteristics in a donut, you probably wouldn't sell very many donuts. So it's just the opposite with the donuts. You're going to use a flour that has typically a lower protein content, less of that gluten-forming protein quality, so that you get a product that's very tender and fragile.
The basic conventional flour milling process is just a continuing process of grinding and sifting and purification. Now, when we talk about whole wheat flour versus white flour, whole wheat flour, the whole wheat flour process is, there are a lot of different ways to produce whole wheat flour. We can have whole wheat flour that is a stone ground whole wheat that is in a single pass. The whole wheat is introduced into stone grinding rolls, and you have a whole wheat product coming out of the grinding passage, and that is a very basic whole wheat process. And whole wheat can also be, if we think of gram flour is defined as a special classification of whole wheat flour, and gram flour is basically, by definition, fine bran blended back into white flour. So you have your conventional flour milling process where you're making white flour, then you grind the bran back up into a flour-like particle size, and you blend them back together, and that is also another way of making whole wheat flour, is blending the bran. By definition, whole wheat flour is simply a flour product that has the same constituents as a whole grain kernel of wheat. So the way you get to whole wheat flour can take many different paths.
When you're using a whole wheat flour, the baker generally has to add other ingredients to get the same look and size and shape and appearance of a loaf of white bread, because that's what the customer expects. They expect whole wheat bread that looks like white bread. And to get that, the baker has to add some other things to it, which ultimately makes it a more difficult product to make and typically a more expensive product to make. Well, from an FDA, Food and Drug Administration standpoint, there are different regulations for what the baker can make and call wheat bread and what they can call whole wheat bread. If you're going to call a product whole wheat, then you have to use 100% whole wheat flour into that product. And you can't, from a technical standpoint, even mill the flour down and then recombine it. It has to be 100% of that ground reduced wheat berry that's going into that product then. Whereas something that they call wheat bread, you can have a much smaller fraction of some wheat flour, whole wheat flour in there, or even just add wheat bran back to it and still call it wheat bread. In the U.S. baking industry, the regulations are set by the Food and Drug Administration on things like what can you call a whole wheat product versus what can you call a wheat product. How can you label a product as having certain enrichment characteristics or delivering certain vitamins or that sort of thing. So there's quite a few regulations, and those are all overseen by the Food and Drug Administration. You'll see some flour out there that says that it's bleached, along with probably being enriched or fortified. Bleached flour simply means that at the very end of the milling process, the miller is adding something that whitens the flour so that white flour makes whiter bread, is essentially that. Now, years and years ago, the process was such that the millers would mill the wheat into flour, and then it would set for days or weeks at a time, and that bleaching, much of that same bleaching effect will happen naturally to flour over time. But because in this day and age, flour is largely milled, put on a truck, shipped to a bakery, and used within a very short amount of time, it won't naturally whiten. So there is an additive that all it does is take out the color pigments, is all it does. Why does a miller add this bleaching step into his process? It's really just done for a visual appeal, so that the final customer will see a whiter loaf of bread, a lighter colored cake or bagel or whatever that application is, because that's what's more appealing, I guess, is the only reason behind that. There's no danger in it. It's perfectly safe. It's approved by the FDA. Everybody's been doing it for years. Can you make flour unbleached? Sure. It's going to perform exactly the same way.
That wraps it up for this episode of Real Ag. We hope the information presented here gives you a better understanding of this often overlooked process. On behalf of the Real Ag crew, I'm Kyle Bauer, helping you sort the truth and helping you understand Real Ag.
Production of Real Ag is made possible in part by an underwriting grant from the Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.